Hi, welcome to the podcast. So in this episode, I claim that there are two main strains of religious thought. I'll just keep this monologue focused on the two strains within Christian thought, but my sense is that these two strains exist in all religious traditions. So the first way of thinking, the first strain of thought within religion, is the one that anyone raised religious acquires first. This is the religious consciousness that is transmitted mostly by words, but also by liturgical features. This first way, divided and subdivided, categorized and formalized, because it is extrinsic, explicit, and physical. It is the sum total of the doctrines and the expression of the doctrines of a given religion. It is inculcated the same way that the state capitals and spelling are taught to second graders. When a child memorizes the Lord's Prayer or the Apostles' Creed, he is learning in the first major strain of religious thought. This is the first strain of thought, you understand? By contrast, there is a second sort of religious thought. And before I try to describe and define it, I want you to watch this 1-minute clip of Bernardo Kastrup struggling to describe and define it himself.
We have to be very careful about translating an ineffable but true insight into a narrative, because that translation distorts the true insight, and we begin living something that is actually false. This happens a lot with religion. People who have a true insight that if they translate, they cannot translate in any other way by saying, I am God. But then, the moment they say that, it's no longer true.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see what I'm trying to hint at?
So, yeah.
When the Buddhists say, nothing is going on, there is nothing. I know why they are saying that, but the moment it's said, it's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
The moment it's worded, it's false.
Okay, this second strain of religious thought often retains everything from the first strain, but it always places one crucial cornerstone beneath all of the doctrine, or before all of the doctrine, before the liturgy, before the language of institutional religion. As clearly as I can put it, the second strain of thought never forgets that the essence of religion, the final telos of religion, is in the service of something that is ineffable. This is why Kastrup says, do you see what I'm trying to hint at? This kind of language is very common in the second strain of thinking.
Do you see what I'm trying to hint at?
The clip from Kastrup raises one really interesting question for me, and that is, why is it against the rules, as he puts it, to come out and declare, I am God, as his hypothetical person who has attained religious insight wants to do? Later in the video, Kastrup compares this utterance to an illegal move in chess. He says it ruins the game, and so we must not say it. We must play the game by the rules of the game. And one of the main rules is, you do not say that. And yet, take a look at the Wikipedia page on theosis. Read Clement of Alexandria on the process of man becoming God. For if one knows himself, he will know God, and knowing God, he will be made like God, not by wearing gold or long robes, but by well-doing, and by requiring as few things as possible. Now, God alone is in need of nothing, and rejoices most when he sees us bright with the ornament of intelligence. That man has the form which is of the Word. He is made like to God. He is beautiful. He does not ornament himself. His is beauty, the true beauty, for it is God, and that man becomes God, since God so wills. Heraclitus then rightly said, men are gods, and gods are men. For the Word himself is the manifest mystery, God in man, and man, God. The idea, then, isn't totally foreign to Christianity. The Roman Catholics have tended to be more circumspect than the Orthodox, but even their mystics come right up to the edge of saying it. Now, consider the problem as a purely rhetorical one. Forgetting about the percentages, let's just stipulate that some amount of people, including some who are religious, are not even aware of this second strain of religious thought. And, well, it's understandable that they're not aware of it because it isn't spoken of much, because it can't be spoken of. That's one of the rules, right? The example I like to use here is to compare this person in the first strain of thought to a 5-year-old child who may understand absolutely nothing about the category of romantic love. The adult who tries to communicate to this child what romantic love is will have to resort to analogies and verbally indirect allusions because, again, the rules are that you can't just come out and say it. Because if you did, the child still wouldn't understand you and would probably think you sound creepy or weird. In fact, many of you will have seen a child, even as late as 10 years of age, recoil in horror when an adult prophesies that the child will grow up and fall in love and get married. Children hate this thought. They hate it because they do not understand it at all. And they don't understand it because they have no experience of it. The adults, at this point, often just shrug and laugh. But it's funny to think how odd it would be for the adult to double down and say to the child, no, wait. In fact, I can prove to you by a series of rational demonstrations and proof texts that I am correct and that you will experience romantic love. Such a scene would be absurd, and only the most autistic adult would press the matter to that degree, especially if the child is made uncomfortable. Instead, very reasonably, the adult simply shrugs, gives up on the topic, maybe smiles, and allows the child to go on believing something that is almost certainly untrue, namely that they'll never fall in love with anyone. In the same way, the people in the second strain of religious thought, the mystics, who assume among themselves at least that they have a fuller picture and that those in the first strain of thought simply know nothing of a phenomenon which really does exist. These mystics do generally simply smile and shrug, and in the same way as the adult, they just drop the subject and let the naive child continue in his naivete. The person who exists in the first strain of religious thought, where everything is assumed to be explicit, external, physical, and utterable, this person cannot imagine that the second strain of thought exists, because he cannot fathom that there are unspeakable things, or that there might be people who have experienced things that he has not. So he may easily make it to age 40 and never suspect that the second strain of thought even exists, because 99% of the people in the second strain camp simply shrug and smile and basically stick to saying things that first strain of thought people can understand. In effect, people who believe second strain of thought ideas nevertheless live and behave and sound like people who remain in first strain thought. When we say ineffable, we mean it. The content of the second strain of thought genuinely cannot be told. It truly resists articulation in language, not so much because its content is unutterable, as because the content of it cannot be heard by those who have not already experienced it for themselves. So let me just try to get to my point here. If there is any truth to this second strain of religious thought, so if, for example, Jesus' teaching to Nicodemus in John 3 about being born again is in fact a hint that such an experience is the essence of salvation, is necessary for salvation, that no salvation exists outside of such conversion. If such a conversion is actually the cornerstone of all religion, if it is ultimately the aim of all religious teaching, then some interesting ideas follow naturally. First, there will be two types of people in our societies: those who have been converted and those who have not. Now, if it is true that these seem to be outwardly indistinguishable, because, again, that means because the second strain of thinking basically goes unuttered because it can't be uttered, or can't be uttered because it can't be heard, right? If that's all true, and that does seem to be true, since, as I said above, so many people might make it to age 40 without even noticing that this second strain type of person exists, as second strain thought is uttered so seldom, then you might think it doesn't matter what percentage of people in a society are converted and what percentage are not. Perhaps you want to make the case that this is a sort of closed metaphysical box. It's a Schrodinger's cat of the soul sort of thing. It's pure abstraction. It doesn't matter. But let me change some of our circumstances to see if we can reconceive this situation. Imagine that conversion does matter. Imagine that when a person converts, he is fundamentally reoriented. He stops aiming toward the objects of the world and begins to aim toward God. If it's easier, think of the allegory of the cave from Socrates, Book 7 of the Republic, right? Inside the cave, before anyone is brought out, there's only one strain of thought, and it is an incomplete or even false strain. We have to point that out here. But when the experiencer is dragged up out of the cave and shown the three-dimensional world, and as Plato says, last of all, the sun itself, then it is then that the second strain of thought is born. But does he simply run back down into the cave and announce the new truths he has gleaned from his experience? Of course not. And why not? Well, because he only appears to those who never left the cave as a shadow, and his voice only comes to them as an echo. And if he tries to speak about things like dimension or color, the cave dwellers, like the 5-year-olds who have not experienced romantic love, will literally not be able to understand what he is saying. If he is finally dragged back down into the cave himself, he will certainly never forget what he saw outside of the cave, and he will also forever be stuck with the problem of ineffability. But now, imagine that this, the scene in the cave, is a corollary for what religion actually is. Just imagine with me. Imagine that religious conversion amounts to reorienting oneself toward what is actually real, turning away from a conception of the world that is based on the shadows on the cave wall. Imagine that first man to be taken outside the cave. Certainly he will want to tell the people who never left of the world above. Maybe he can communicate some of it to them by analogy. Maybe he can stage some sort of a play down there in the cave that will give them the idea of the world outside the cave. Could he manage to become some sort of shaman? Is it even possible that he could develop some sequence of teachings that would get these people, again, none of whom has ever visited the outside world, to orient their lives to the overworld, even though they do not get to visit it themselves? Could he orchestrate some sort of liturgical rites that would prepare them to see the overworld itself? And is it possible that this is what religion has been trying to do all along? Now, hopefully you see that the difference between strain 1 and strain 2 religious thought might matter a great deal even if the differences are almost imperceptible at first glance. Actually, it should seem strange to you now that strain 1 religious thought should even exist at all. After all, it is only the person who was dragged up out of the cave that initiated what we are calling strain 2 thinking. It was he who went back down into the cave and felt motivated to tell his fellow troglodytes that the shadows weren't real. But how could there be a pretender strain of thought? How could such a thing arise unless it was imitating the strain of thought initiated by the overworld experiencer? In fact, this is how I believe religious teaching began. Someone did get dragged up, so to speak, caught the real revelation, saw that all was one, or that he was God, or however we want to phrase this unphrasable insight. And then he realized that everyone around him had no notion of the reality he had just witnessed. He was convinced it was real. He was convinced he had seen something more true than anyone had ever seen before, and he wanted to tell them about it. Wanting to share his insight, he began thinking of ways to communicate it. Maybe stories, maybe rituals, maybe taboos, or rules, or sacred words. None of this stuff was the thing itself. It was all intended to point those who had never experienced what he experienced toward the thing itself. And maybe some of the techniques, these teachings, worked. Maybe a certain percentage of the people around him really began to understand that life isn't merely what it appears to be at first glance. It's not just the shadows on the cave wall. Somehow his teachings had broken through, had bridged the gap. Now, not everybody understood, but some did. All around him, the people in his tribe were now saying the sacred words, avoiding the taboos, doing the rituals, telling the stories. And he was happy to see them doing these things, because he had designed these things to hint at something ineffable. As the people around him did the behaviors, a few of them really started to get it, and maybe even popped into the ineffable experience for themselves. They were converted. And now, like their first teacher, they too felt strongly motivated to catalyze the same experience in the people around them who had yet to get it. Maybe they added more teachings, more rites and rituals. A whole liturgy grew up around this effort to propel others to have the experience. But not everyone got it. Some number of the people in the tribe did all the rituals and rites and said all of the words, but they never got the revelation. This problem persisted for a long time. Maybe the original teacher died, but some still had not been converted. And yet, strangely, I want to speculate, some of those who were not converted, who had never had the ineffable experience for themselves, nevertheless started to enjoy doing the rites and rituals. For them, the rites and rituals became sort of a culture and became an end in themselves. Some of you will remember my episode on Buddha's Diamond Sutra. There's that part where Buddha says to his disciples, quote, "When the Buddha explains these things using such concepts and ideas, people should remember the unreality of all such concepts and ideas. They should recall that in teaching spiritual truths, the Buddha always uses these concepts and ideas in the way that a raft is used to cross a river. Once the river has been crossed over, the raft is of no more use and should be discarded. These arbitrary concepts and ideas about spiritual things need to be explained to us as we seek to attain enlightenment. However, ultimately, these arbitrary conceptions can be discarded." But some of the people who heard the concepts and ideas simply didn't receive the transmission. And yet, oddly, they enjoyed hearing the concepts and ideas. So in short, They kept the raft. They kept carrying it. They even became protective of it. And they persist in carrying the raft, even to this day. Or so my argument goes. And the point is, strangely enough, strain one of religious thought is hypothesized here to actually be an echo of the more primal strain two thought. What you have is a situation where the original experiencer, who was dragged up out of the cave, saw the truth. He returned to the cave, and he began his teaching, trying to hint to those who had never left the cave of what reality outside the cave actually was. Most of the people in the cave enjoyed hearing his teachings, but only some of them actually got it. Among those who didn't get it, some enjoyed his teachings anyway, so much so that a whole school of teaching was founded. These people, among whom none had ever seen the overworld itself, became quite serious about the teachings. The teachings became for them something sort of sacred, no longer as a means, but now as an end in themselves. These people became so serious about the teachings that they started silencing dissent, or at least mocking all who taught otherwise. Such a thing could happen, I surmise. In fact, if the thing itself, the overworld, is difficult to communicate, we would expect that only a few would be able to grasp it without seeing it for themselves. The numbers of those who never go outside the cave and who never grasp the essence of what is outside the cave might be far greater than those who get it. And by virtue of their great numbers, their own, now false, teachings might easily become the dominant form of teachings. They would end up teaching with firm authority and little tolerance for dissent, an entire doctrine, an entire orthodoxy, scoffing at any who reject their teachings, all this without having even the slightest clue about what's actually going on outside the cave. None of them have visited. And this could happen even if they retained, for example, the name of the true teacher who did first exit the cave. Their story could even be mostly correct. Their teachings might even accidentally still occasionally propel one of the cave dwellers to have an actual experience of leaving the cave, even though they themselves, the teachers of the teachings, never left the cave. But in those cases, the people who accidentally go see the world above had better be careful in announcing when they go back to the cave that what they saw is actually quite a thing apart from the teachings. Because now the teachers do not take kindly to some commoner hinting that he actually knows more than they do. Think of Matthew 23:12 here. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. How can we distinguish then between true teachers and false teachers? I suspect that it's difficult to say exactly how. Maybe we can know them by their fruits. Maybe true teachers and false teachers look almost exactly the same to the uninitiated. One thing that I try to listen for is whether people get most worked up about their particular teachings and their liturgy and their texts and their community, their raft, so to speak, or by contrast, whether they are continually trying to allude to the big change itself, the inner thing, the essential conversion. If it sounds like I'm picking on the Orthodox or the Catholics here, I am. But it's not just them. When Protestants get all wound up about the 5 solas or start muttering tulip, if they're Calvinists, they're probably making the same sort of mistake. But any real second strain person, second strain of thought, should be able to hear the same truth in John Calvin that they heard earlier from Clement of Alexandria. Here's Calvin from chapter 1 of his Institutes of the Christian Religion. Quote, "Our wisdom, insofar as it ought to be deemed true and solid wisdom, consists almost entirely of two parts, the knowledge of God and of ourselves. But as these are connected together by many ties, it is not easy to determine which of the two precedes and gives birth to the other." And again, in case you missed it, here's Clement, quote, "For if one knows himself, he will know God, and knowing God, he will be made like God." But look around, sure enough, Calvinists and Orthodox will make fun of each other and act as though only one can be the true church. The true church. What is the true church? Almost all institutional church members will believe that it must be an institutional church, a building or an institution. The Roman Catholics love to trot out the "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church" line from, I think, Matthew 16. They always sound so insecure to me with this exegesis. Because, read the entire section. It is a crucial point in favor of second strain thinking. Go back and watch my episode on Jonathan Edwards if you haven't lately. How does one recognize the Christ? That's what he asks his disciples there. And Peter gets it right. And what does he say in that section? Not by flesh and blood, right? Not by extrinsic signs. Ironically, the very thing Christ appears to be teaching in that section is here rejected and inverted in order to form what? An extrinsic institution that reveals things supposedly by flesh and blood. The point is, differences in teaching. Again, think back to my extended allegory of the cave. Differences in teaching should be no threat at all, considered from the second strain perspective. They either work to catalyze the liberating experience, or they don't. They either remove the shackles you were born with, or they don't. Can multiple methods work? Sure, I say. Now, those who are first strain thinkers will surely object here. But that's relativism. You're saying anything can be the truth. No, I'm not. I'm saying anything that catalyzes this particular and real change in psyche ought to be welcomed. Does the teaching make me more like Christ? Then I welcome it. And how exactly do I mean that? Well, does it turn me away from my attachment to the things of the world, my illusions, the shadows on the cave wall? Does it orient me toward the good itself, toward God? Then I'm in. Recall Jesus' reproach of the Pharisees and the Sadducees in Matthew 16:3. He says, quote, "You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky." He's using predicting the weather here as an example of acuity of objective perception. And then continuing, he says, "But you cannot interpret the signs of the times." That is, you don't understand what's going on, right? Or even more clearly in John 7:24, he says, "Stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly." Now, does any of what I've said mean you have to drop your affiliation with institutions or stop doing your rites and rituals? No. Let me say that again. No. The worst these things can do for you is kind of nothing at all. At worst, they're as harmless as anything else. And if you think they might propel you toward a truer understanding of reality, I don't know, maybe they will. Stick with them. I guess you'll find out. But I retain in my imagination a couple of key ideas. John the Baptist's dad was a priest who served in the temple. which means John was in line to step into that institutional role. He did not, but instead he discovered truth in a desert. Jesus also was familiar with institutional religion, but he was never content to let it be about something other than his life. When he reads Isaiah aloud in the synagogue, he interprets it as being about him. What a scandal, right? And most importantly of all, yes, most importantly of all, Paul himself working on behalf of established institutional religion, received the revelation of second strain thought on the road to Damascus and realized all at once that there was another level of color, dimensionality. He realized that he had been oriented wrongly before, but he was now oriented rightly. There were Christians before Paul, but I want to suggest that if they had any merit, if there was anything that indicated the honor and greatness of the pre-Pauline church, it was precisely the fact that they were able to hear in Paul's teachings, which were new, something true, something that established itself as authoritative not by institutional authority, but by direct revelation. Paul told them he heard Jesus, and they believed him. You might be a member of an institution that would be unlikely to receive such a second-hand revelation, an institution that kind of rolls its eyes at the coming of new prophecy, or that even mocks those who try their best to hint at the second strain of thought. And I say it's fine to be a member of that institution. But keep in mind that one of the fundamental and seemingly telltale signs of the earliest Christian church was its ability and willingness to incorporate new revelations. Paul's letters were written between about 48 AD and 60 AD. They were written before the Gospels, before there was a Bible. And yet, they were affirmed later as authoritative by Luke in the book of Acts. The point is, there is no Christianity that does not accept Paul's revelation as real. And what was Paul's revelation? It was no institutional thing. When it came to him, he was blind for 3 days and neither ate nor drank anything. This kind of experience must remain a part of Christianity, or Christianity itself will pass away and be replaced by some other loose series of gestures and signs and speech acts that all not only allow for this kind of experience, but that intend to catalyze exactly that sort of experience.